Friends, let's pause and offer prayer as we start. Well, Father, what a full 2 days we've had, and how many things we are pondering and newly excited about, newly anxious about, newly interested in, newly confused about. How many new people we've met and been impressed by and encouraged by, have felt a little bit of competition with, have wondered if we came off as well to them as they did to us. All these things that swirl through our minds at this point, as well as the fatigue of 2 very full days. Holy Spirit, you're here with us in this moment, just as you have been all along. And you have something particular for us in these last minutes of this time that you couldn't have given us before and that you can't give us tomorrow. So we open ourselves to what you want to do in us for the sake of your gospel. And we thank you that you're here. In Jesus' name, amen. I thought we'd end this amazing couple days with a downer of a talk title. I've been thinking about this phrase, change the world, for the past few years. And a couple years ago, a friend of mine challenged me with kind of an interesting experiment. We went to the online catalog, what used to be called the card catalog, of the Harvard University library system. One of the most extensive library collections in the world, and it's all searchable, of course, online. And we searched for books whose title or subtitle contained the phrase, change the world, or changing the world. So it's just a very simple search, change the world or changing the world, somewhere in the title, just to see how many books there were. And the interesting thing we found, we did this first about 9 years ago in 2004. We found that between 2000 and 2004, 75 books were published that talked one way or another about changing the world. So these were books like The Riddle of the Compass, the invention that changed the world, the compass. 100 Bible verses that changed the world. I guess the world has been changed 100 times by 100 different Bible verses. Mauve, how one man invented a color that changed the world. 75 books just in 5 years, 2000 to 2004, that had changed the world in the title. So a couple years later, I went back, I did again towards the end of the 2010s. And by the end of 2010, instead of, well, actually, this was 2008. I've gone back every few years. So at the end of 2008, there were now 154 books from 2000 to 2007, so it had doubled. And I projected that by 2010, for that decade, there would be 220 books about changing the world. In fact, I just went back and did this again this morning and looked at 2000 to 2010, and actually there were about 250 books, so the rate increased. Since 2010, there have been 82 books cataloged in the Harvard Library System in the last 3 years of publishing that talk about changing the world. The one that I liked the best was Lifeblood, Changing the World One Dead Mosquito at a Time. Isn't that awesome? Banana, the fate of the fruit that changed the world. Tea, the drink that changed the world. Nixon and Mao, the week that changed the world. Thermopylae, the battle that changed the world. Nice Girls Don't Change the World. That's by a woman named Lynn Hybels. 5 equations that changed the world. 5 speeches that changed the world. 13 creative men who changed the world. 12 lesbians who changed the world. This is all in the last 13 years of publishing. Now you go back, this is the interesting thing to do, you go back and you look at previous decades. So go back and look at the 1990s. And in the 1990s, my clicker is not working, so I'm going to stop trying to click with it. In all of the 1990s, there were only 100 books with Change the World in the title. In the 1980s, there were only 18 books with this in the title. 1970s, 4 books in the whole decade that talked about changing the world. 1960s were a good decade. There were 8. 4 in the 1950s, and then if you start in 1900 and go through 1949, the first half of the 20th century, lots of books in the Harvard catalog, but only 6 of them in that whole half century talk about changing the world. And so actually that bar is misleading, right? Because that's only about 1 a decade. The oldest book in the world, printed book, is Gutenberg's Bible, published in 1455. Between 1455, and the Harvard Library has a copy of Gutenberg's Bible, so it's the earliest printed book in the catalog. Between 1455 and 1899, do you know how many books were published about how to change the world, or changing the world, or the drink that changed the world? 0. In all those centuries in which lots of things happened that we would say changed the world, no one thought to write a book about changing the world. So I've done a little bit of regression analysis on this curve, and I predict there are 200,000 books published a year, give or take 100,000. So I predict that at the current rate of change, by 2100, every book published will be about how to change the world. No one ever thought to write a book about this until the last 100 years. And just in the last 10 years, by the way, the rate we're on, this decade it'll be about 300 books. It is still increasing. You would think someone would get the message that this meme is getting played out, but not yet. Why are there so many books about changing the world? I have a theory. My job as a journalist is to come up with theories for these kind of things. I have a theory about this proliferation of books. I think we want to change the world. That's my grand theory. I think this is answering a hunger that somehow people never had or didn't articulate in this way. And now everywhere you turn, someone's talking about how you can change the world. My hotel, not the Hotel Lincoln where I stayed courtesy of this conference last night, but a couple nights ago had a little explanation of their linens policy that saves water and saves them a lot of money, and it's a very good thing to do, not to change the linens every day. We don't do that at my house. Why do it at the hotel? And at the bottom it said, as it explained this, by the way, completely involuntary policy that they just impose on you, 1 person can change the world. So just by sleeping in that hotel that night and letting them not change the sheets, I actually think this is an exhausting thing to try to do. I think it's actually not the right goal for human beings. I think actually what's happening in this anxiety about changing the world is this sense that the world is changing too fast. We're trying to get a handle on it. Maybe it was tea that did it. Maybe it was bananas. Maybe it was mauve. But gosh, what explains how it's all changed? And we desperately want to feel like we're part of this vast, rapid-paced change. And there's this tremendous anxiety that we're getting left out or left behind or not important, not significant, as all these other things change the world. And in a way, it's the ultimate bait and switch because it gets you so excited about your role in the world, but it's also predicated on you feeling so small and like you really can't do very much. And I've actually come to believe the best possible news we could hear is that we are not the people who will change the world. And this is where I want to leave you in the next few minutes. By the end of this time, I want you to feel like it's good news that you are not called to change the world. And I want to tell you how not to do it in 3 easy steps. Why do we believe that you can change the world? It's very interesting when you start actually looking at examples of people who set out to do it. See, one thing I notice as a journalist when I look at all these titles, most of them are retrospective. They look back and they say, the banana did it, right? Or this, Thermopylae did it. These speeches did it. But my question is, what about when you set out to change it? That is, you're looking prospectively rather than retrospectively. What do we find? Well, it happens that advanced capitalism has an incredible test bed to test theories of world changing, and it's called the capital or equity markets. The equity markets are open generally 5 days a week, 9:30 to 4, and really all around the clock now. And in the equity markets, investors, people, as it were, with stakes to bet, place bets on what companies are going to be disproportionately successful in changing the world, right? That's what a bet in an equity market is. It's a bet that this company currently is undervalued. People don't see how much it's going to change the world, and you think they're going to make it. And so you invest a little bit of your resources with them and see if it grows. So we've got this massive market going on every day in bets on who's going to change the world successfully. Will it be Samsung? Will it be Apple, Microsoft, Google? Will it be CN Railroad? Will it be Berkshire Hathaway? Will it be Genesee Railroad? In every sector, people are trying to place bets on who's going to change the world. And here's the interesting thing. We have discovered, as people have studied these active investor models, that most financial professionals, people who are paid sometimes extraordinary amounts of money to do better than just the average of the market at predicting world changing, most of them fail to beat the market. Less than 50% in any given year succeed in predicting who's going to change the world. And these are folks who every day wake up. We did a little session on trends today, and we spent an hour with some of the folks talking about global trends. We spent 1 hour. These folks are paid 40 hours, maybe 60 hours a week, with lots of training, lots of resources to look at global trends and figure out what's going to happen and where the bets should be placed. And every year, more than half of them do not even match what would happen if you just put your money in an index fund and walked away for 365 days and came back. And here's the other interesting thing. In any given year, it's under 50%. But the longer you ask them to beat the market, the fewer of them succeed. So that, sorry, I have to check my notes, over a 30-year period, over 30 years, of the people who stay in business for 30 years actively managing money, 97% trail the market. 97% of those who are paid over, it would be kind of sad, wouldn't it, at the end of 30 years? I wasted my life and a bunch of people's money because if they had just put it in the market and not tried to touch it and just let it be, they would have done better than they did with me. This is why you don't hear about this very much, but it's true. And here's the interesting thing. Why don't we believe that this is true? Why do we still put our money with these folks? So many people, so many institutions, corporations, paying them very high fees to try to beat the market when we know it won't. And there's a lot of reasons why we don't believe it. But the most interesting one to me is what statisticians call survivor bias. And survivor bias refers to the fact that when you look at a population of people trying to do something, some of them will completely fail, and they'll drop out of your sample before you finish the time period that you're testing over, right? And if you don't pay attention to that, you will at the end say you want to measure people over 10 years. Well, maybe a whole bunch of people will stop even trying to manage money during those 10 years. And they'll go on to sell insurance or become a pastor or some other more profitable occupation, right? Well, at the end of the 10 years, the only people you have left were people who managed to do it for the whole 10 years. And if you don't adjust for that in your statistics, you get what statisticians call survivor bias. You're only measuring the performance of the most successful, and you're not accounting for the performance of the people who didn't even manage to perform enough to be measured, right? Survivor bias is a very powerful way of us, when we look at the world, we tell the stories of the survivors. So we talk about mauve, the color that changed the world. But spare a thought for burnt orange, which never changed the world, as far as I know, unless you're a Tennessee fan, I guess, right? Right? We don't hear about all the other colors that didn't change the world. All the stories we tell are about the ones who succeeded. But we never tell the stories, potentially, of the many, many more colors, kinds of drinks, speeches, battles, that did not change the world. Survivor bias. Peter Lynch managed Fidelity's Magellan Fund for 14 years in the 80s and 90s, I guess it was. And he delivered returns of 29% per year, the best run of any active mutual fund manager ever. He discipled a young man named Robert Stansky, Bob Stansky. Bob Stansky studied at the feet of Peter Lynch, worked with him at Magellan, absorbed Peter Lynch's incredible insights into investing. And when Peter Lynch retired from the Magellan Fund, Bob Stansky took over after this amazing run. Bob Stansky managed the Magellan Fund for 9 years, and the top line is the S&P 500, The blue line is Fidelity's just ordinary, we aren't doing anything except just trying to invest your money reasonably. And the bottom line is Stansky's Magellan Fund. He underperformed the S&P 500 by 75 percentage points over 9 years. No one talks about Bob Stansky. Poor Bob Stansky. Do you ever feel like Bob Stansky? I feel like Bob Stansky. People ran Christianity Today, and it was awesome for a long time. But maybe they were just partly lucky or in a particularly benign environment. And now I'm leading it, and I wonder, am I Bob Stansky? Like, they're going to remember the Peter Lynch, but will anyone, right? Do you ever feel like you've stepped into a situation that seems like it was so abundant over the previous leadership, but now you're like, wait, I absorbed all their insights. I'm trying to do everything they did. We're trying to keep their values. It's not working in the same way. Survivor bias. Poor Bob Stansky. I feel like I need to mention him in talks just so that we don't forget him. And here's the other thing. It happens at events like this. We come here because all of us, someone spotted something in us. Either actual accomplishment or potential accomplishment, and they've said, you know, you could be part of changing the world, or maybe you already have. There are people in this room who have done amazing things. It's very intimidating. But of course, we don't see all the people who aren't in this room. We don't see the people who went into the ministry that we love with the same amount of passion, same amount of heart, same commitment, but then burnt out or made a couple crucial mistakes or lost the confidence of a central stakeholder. And they don't come to conferences like this anymore. And then there's a question. There's so much talent, so much energy in this room, and a lot of youth, and it's awesome. But I ask myself, in 20 years, how many of us will be in rooms like this? And how many of us will just we ran so hard trying to change the world that we'll run out of steam long before the faithfulness is measured. And we won't even be in the final sample of how we did at changing the world because we didn't do it in the way that was sustainable, that could lead to real abundant fruitfulness, where the 97% are just going to kind of ever trail further behind and one day just give up. I wish that were just a fanciful, or I wish that were a rhetorical device to get us feeling emotional, which it isn't, because it's all too real in ministry and especially nonprofit work, the kind of organizations we lead that aren't deeply resourced institutions. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of difficulty, and the burnout is huge. I'm haunted by the artist who could have changed the world and was indeed the most successful artist in all of the history of art, if you measure it by compensation. And his name was Thomas Kinkade. More paintings sold than any other artist, more money made than any other artist. Thomas Kinkade, the painter of light with a little trademark after it, painted paintings like this one, which is a local scene, Chicago Water Tower, right? And it's not very good. It's really sentimental, and there's a lot of problems with this painting. I'll just tell you one, maybe two. So when the human eye looks out across a depth of field, some things are in focus and some things are not. It's sort of a basic principle of optics, right? But it's a little hard to see when it's projected. But in this painting, everything is in focus. The foreground is in focus, the water tower is in focus, there's lots of detail there, the trees behind the water tower are in focus. It's kind of overly, it's like someone applied too much sharpen filter in Photoshop. And then there's the problem of the lights, which are just, there's too many. There's all this light, it's kind of like saying light, light, light in the background, right? And then there's the problem of too many subjects. There's this bright red umbrella on the left, and then this blue carriage on the right, and then this vivid water tower in the center, and you don't quite know where to look, and you don't know what this painting is about. But what you do get is this kind of feeling you get from a postcard. It's kind of a nice little postcard. It's not very good, and artists look at this and they're like, it's not so good. The interesting thing is, Kinkade was basing his painting on a painting, an earlier painting by an artist who had painted the same scene. Kinkade was borrowing this previous scene to make this rendition. And I want to show you this earlier painting that was influencing Kinkade. And rather than talk about it, what I'd like you to do is actually talk with your neighbor about the painting on the left, which is the earlier painting of the water tower. We'll call it Water Tower 1, and then Kincaid's painting of Water Tower 2. And as you compare them, what do you notice? Just turn to one neighbor and just for a second, look at it together and talk about what you notice about the differences between these two paintings, the earlier one on the left and the Kincaid one on the right. Go ahead. A couple more seconds. Okay, finish that thought. So let's talk about it together for a minute. What do you see? What are some of the differences? What makes the painting on the left a little different, the earlier painting a little different from Kincaid's painting? What did you comment on?
The first one draws you in.
If you said the first one draws you in. Why?
Because there's a light, there's a focus that says, come across the street, walk across the street, and come into the water tower. And I feel like the second one says, stay on your side of the street, stay across from the water tower, don't come in.
Wow. The first one, that's amazing observation. I don't know if everybody could hear, but on the one on the left, because it has a very clear central focus, the light is kind of concentrated, draws you across the street. Whereas the one on the right that has all these things to look at, makes you more feel like you just want to stand and observe. It doesn't pull you the way the one on the left does. Beautifully put. Wow. What else? Yeah. Looks like there's a conflagration in the background. Yes. He's kind of gotten out of control there. But the one on the left uses light in a much more careful way, doesn't it? Yeah. One or two more observations? Yeah. The trees are bigger. Yes, the trees on the right have shrunk. But the trees on the left are larger. They're rendered in more interesting ways. They're actually more interesting forms. He's let the forms of the tree, the artist on the left has let the forms of the tree kind of play a bigger part in the painting. They're not just kind of tree decoration. Yeah, very interesting. And one last comment? Yeah. Yes, much more contrast in focus. Some things are in focus, some are not. Much more contrast of light and dark, this effect we call chiaroscuro, where we balance light and dark. Artists and art critics, art historians look at the painting on the left and they say, that's not bad. That is a pretty fine painting. And now here's the question. Does anyone know the name of the artist who painted the painting on the left? Have you seen it in a museum or? Bob Stansky. Oh, if only it were true. The name of the artist on the left is Thomas Kincaid. Thomas Kincaid painted both of these paintings. He painted the one on the left about 7 years before the one on the right. He painted a better painting earlier in his life than later in his life. What happened to Thomas Kincaid? What happened that this guy with significant artistic gifts, I mean really, this guy could paint. That's not a bad painting on the left. I would not be offended to have that in my home by any means. It draws you in. It says something about life. It captures a moment. How did that guy who could paint that stuff end up painting postcards? Well, do you know the answer? The one on the right sold. Thomas Kincaid made millions of dollars painting postcards because that's what his audience wanted. That's what the market rewarded. I can't believe but that Thomas Kincaid, as a young painter, had a vision of doing something significant with his art. He was a follower of Christ. He wanted to do something that communicated through his art. But over his life, he got worse and worse as he got more and more successful, which raises a horrifying possibility that the worst thing that could happen when you try to change the world is not that you fail and drop out and become Bob Stansky, but that you succeed and become Thomas Kincaid at the end of his life. And I was with a mutual friend, a person who was a mutual friend of, who was a friend of Thomas Kincaid. I did not know Thomas Kincaid. I was with a friend just last week who knew him. Thomas Kincaid drank himself to death after becoming very abusive towards his family and his employees. And my friend said the reason Thomas ended up drinking himself to death is he couldn't bear what had happened to his art. But he felt caught in this commercial machine he'd made. Set out to change the world, ended up changed by the world. And those gifts that are so evident on the left are almost gone. They're just shadows of their former selves on the right. Is there another way? Is there another way to be part of change in this world that obviously needs change? I think there is, and I think it has to do with figuring out what does God do when God sets out to change the world. And this got me thinking about the two events in history that have most changed the world. Forget the banana, forget the color mauve. There are two things that have changed the world more than anything else in history, and I offer this as an empirical claim, not just a faith claim or a rhetorical claim. I think this is empirically true, that the two things that most changed the world were the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I don't believe there are any two events in history that have more altered the lives and the whole course of culture after them. If you don't have the exodus of the Hebrews, you never get the Hebrew Bible. You never get Jerusalem. You never get that whole system of worship of the one true God. You never get the passing on of the stories. They become one more subjugated people ground under the heels of empire, like all the other subjugated peoples whose names we barely know and who only specialists study. And the Hebrews become just one more of those. Instead, today there's an Israel. In this city, there are descendants of those people who came out of Egypt. They've carried on. They have never forgotten. This is one of the amazing things about the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews. They've never forgotten what day it is. The Sabbath has been observed by the people of God for thousands of years. They've never forgotten which day is the seventh day of the week. They stop, they pray, they rest, they worship. None of that happens unless God intervenes in the Exodus and brings Israel out. And then the resurrection of Jesus. Obviously. No Jesus resurrected from the dead. No Park Community Church. This building, poof, it's gone. None of us are here. None of us have the stories we have. The global church, that incredible trend line that Paul showed us, evaporate. By the way, not just that trend line, but Islam too, because Islam is in many ways a Christian heresy. Wouldn't have arisen in the way it did without Christianity. Both those trend lines gone. And all this happens because on the third day, Jesus was raised from the dead by the power of the Spirit, by the will of the Father, and his disciples were transformed. And that little group of people, if there's one group of people you could actually write a book about and say, well, how about, let's say, they turned the world upside down. Because already in Acts, they were saying that about those people. And I will stack the resurrection up against anything else. Our neighbors who sit out on Sunday mornings, stay up late, stay in their bathrobes late into the day on Sunday, reading the New York Times. The most secular people you know are reading the New York Times on Sunday rather than going to work because Jesus rose from the dead on a Sunday. And they don't even know why they're doing it. And they think they're the most secular people on the planet, but their calendar was shaped by the resurrection. It's not, I mean, if you can get people to change their calendar, you've changed the world. And these Jews who had never forgotten what day Sabbath was, suddenly within a few years of the resurrection, well, a few years of crucifixion, and then whatever happened after that, We've got Jews who, instead of getting up and going to work on the first day, are gathering in homes and outside the temple, breaking bread, hearing the word, celebrating the resurrection. How do you get a bunch of Jews who know exactly what day Sabbath is to start worshiping the Lord on Sunday? If not by an absolutely cataclysmic event that upends everything they thought they knew and ushers them into a new creation where they are new beings filled with a new spirit, representing a God who has now made himself known definitively in the world. And they go on, and in 400 years, Rome is majority Christian. So that when Constantine has his little conversion, he's doing what all politicians do. He's like, I can see where this is going, right? And it may have been genuine, as with many politicians. It can be both genuine and expedient at the same time. It's amazing how that works. These are the most world-changing things. So if we can say God acted anywhere without taking God's name in vain, it's Exodus and resurrection. So what do we learn from these? I want to say they challenge our sense of three things. First, they challenge our understanding of time. We want things to happen fast, but God does not seem to be in a hurry. I was with Mark Laberton, the new president of Fuller, and he was talking about what's going to distinguish his presidency. He says that of the many words we can use for God, the one word that we would never use is speedy. Because here's the interesting thing. Now, God brings the Israelites out on a particular date, it seems, and there's a sequence of events. But how long did it take for that to change the world? Well, we have no records of it in Egypt, because Egypt didn't go around building monuments to failed pharaohs, and you can always get another pharaoh. Egypt goes on for a long time, at least 40 years, while the Israelites are just wandering around in the wilderness. And by all appearances, in spite of that cataclysmic event of the loss of the firstborn and the loss of this subjugated population, Egypt goes on. It's only over hundreds of years that the salvation history plays out, and Israel is placed in the land, and they begin to live this distinctive life in the midst of these empires. Resurrection is equally amazing. I mean, yes, it was an incredible event, and yet the week after Easter Sunday, the Pharisees are still fighting with the Sadducees. The Sanhedrin is still in power. Herod is still ruling. Pilate is on to other administrative matters. Decades later, yes, they've said in one city they're turning the world upside down, but the truth is, the Christian movement doesn't even show up in official Roman correspondence until the end of the first century, and then it's just this little footnote in a letter from some bureaucrat to another bureaucrat saying, and there's these weird Christianoi, we're not sure what's going on with them, no big deal, 300 years later, Rome is majority believers. God has a different scale of time. I was so moved by what Dr. Yu said this morning about 20 years. And I thought, what have I given my life to that is 20 years long? And then some of you were with Oliver, who has is it 500-year vision? Something like this. Or 700-year vision? 200-year vision. But don't worry, he has a 70-year strategic plan. That's the way God thinks. God is not in a hurry, and yet God is doing something bigger over time than we can ever imagine. Speaking of time, I'm running out. Place. These two events happen at the edges. They happen in places nobody's paying attention to. Jerusalem is where you're sent if you have failed as a Roman bureaucrat. Pilate is a washed-up bureaucrat. Jerusalem is the edge of the empire. It's not Rome. The Hebrews are spirited out, and they end up on this little truck stop in the ancient Near East where empires roll through with their commercial and military interests. No one thinks Israel is the center of the world. God has a different sense of where the places are that he's going to work. And then these things challenge our sense of power. Two things to say about this. I'm going to be very brief. We think change comes through powerful people. But the Exodus is the deliverance of a completely powerless people who can't even protect their own children from being slaughtered by Pharaoh. And we think, gosh, you have to be vigorous, young, energetic, focused, have strategic vision to do something. Well, Jesus was dead. And you don't get more powerless than dead. And God raised Jesus from the dead. God can use a dead man when the life-giving Spirit is breathed back into that body. The ultimate powerlessness is transfigured into the greatest power ever released in history. And here's the other thing I want to say about power. In these moments of massive cultural change, changing the world, God brings together these weird combinations of power and powerlessness. Because the one who lies in the dust of death is the exalted Son of the Father, who didn't count equality with God something to be grasped. The Son of God becomes the Son of Man. The infinitely powerful becomes the perfectly humble and empties himself, even to the point of death on the cross. Moses is brought into the story in order to not just lead the Hebrews out under cover of night, but to go to Pharaoh, in whose house he grew up, and in a way compel Pharaoh to play a part in this story, whether Pharaoh will or not. And the pattern of when God works to change the world is these weird coalitions of the powerless and the powerful. Not the powerful just doing their own thing, that would be the status quo. Not the powerless rising up and overthrowing the powerful, that would be revolution. But something much more powerful, actually, which is bringing together the power and powerlessness in these paradoxical and surprising combinations. So one example. Oh man, I'm out of time. This is a beautiful island off the coast of one of the most beautiful countries in the world. It's off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa, and its name is Robben Island. And it's the place where the South African apartheid government established a prison where they put Nelson Mandela, who had joined the ANC and was sentenced to life in 1964 and sent to Robben Island, where he spent 27 years total in prison, 18 of them on this island. And to me, the end of apartheid is one of the most dramatic signs of God's continuing work in the world in my lifetime. Because who could have predicted it could have ended peacefully? Everyone thought it was going to end in just a bloodbath as the majority population of that nation overcame the dominant minority. But something happened in South Africa that it's not perfect and it wasn't easy. But there was something beautiful about the way that peacefully that country embraced a land that whites could still live in, that blacks and coloreds could take up their proper places in. And it took time. 27 years in prison for Mandela. It happened in a very unlikely place. The whole point of Robben Island was demoralization. You would sit on this island as a prisoner and you could see Cape Town, where all the power was, where the white government had its seat. But you were cut off from it by unforgiving ocean. And it was designed to place you there and say, you will never again affect that land that you came from. And every day you'll see it, and every day you'll be excluded from it. You are for life here. And ANC members were sent to Robben Island as kind of the ultimate incarceration. What the government didn't take account of was Nelson Mandela. Because what happened is wave after wave of young ANC members would come full of fury and rage at what had happened at their imprisonment. And Mandela would start to induct them into his vision, which he'd expressed in his trial in 1964, that in spite of the violence that the ANC had used to try to bring change, that ultimately there had to be a nonviolent end, that ultimately there had to be a place for white people as well as blacks and coloreds in South Africa. And he inducted them into this vision of a peaceful resolution that they never could have imagined while they were out fighting on the mainland. And Robben Island became known as Mandela's University. It's where a whole generation caught the vision for reconciliation. In that place where you thought nothing was happening, everything of significance was happening. And Robben Island upends our assumptions about power. The white South African government thought that they had the power to imprison Mandela. And actually, in a way, sending him to Robben Island was the biggest mistake they could ever have made, because there was a power at loose in the world sustained by the prayers of countless Christians as well as non-Christians like Mandela that was outside and above and beyond the government's power. And God's power is found in places like Robben Island. One last thing. You hear this phrase a lot, transforming culture, which is just a fancy way of saying changing the world. And I want to say, I believe in transforming culture. I just want to put a different subject on that phrase. You notice it's not a full sentence. It's a participial phrase, transforming culture. What's the subject of the verb, transforming? I do not actually believe in Christians transforming culture. I believe in Christ transforming culture. And here's why. Because when people ask me, Andy, do you want to be part of cultural transformation, changing the world, transforming culture? I say, well, here's my problem. How am I doing at transforming Andy? There's this person who I have total agency and autonomy over. I have a choice about almost everything I do in one way or another. And how am I doing at transforming this one human being? Ask my wife. How could I ever imagine, if I can't transform me, that I could transform the world? Instead, of course, the Christian hope is that God is transforming me. And that involves me surrendering to him, allowing his sense of time, his sense of place and power to become mine. And then gradually I become something he can use. So here's what I've come to believe. We are not the ones to change the world. Instead, we're the ones who go and tell the world that by the gracious power of God, the world has already been changed. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, everybody. We would love if you're open to it to keep
Sure.
doing some Q&A.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yes.
So I will migrate myself to whoever would like to put forward a comment or a question so that you can use the mic. So just raise your hand or yourself if there are any thoughts. We're speechless. Thank you. Sorry. Needed a little spiritual direction there.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. And I had a question just about how to live in that sense of waiting for God and using you. I think it's always difficult for sort of hard-driving type A people who want to change the world and say, is this the time that God's ready to use me? Is this it? Is this it? How do you live into that and be faithful in it?
So I think the single most helpful thing I've found is Sabbath. I think this is the purpose of Sabbath. One day a week, I divest myself of all my world-changing toys. All my glowing rectangles get shut off, and all of the work I do to kind of secure my place in the world gets set aside. And I worship God. I'm with people just because I'm related to them, basically, either my brothers and sisters in Christ or my neighbors or my family. And I lay it all down once a week. And there's a biblical pattern. You're supposed to lay it down every 7 years for a whole year, the Sabbath year. And then every 49 years, whole families and clans that have accumulated the ability to have disproportionate land are supposed to spread it back out again. And I think the practice of Sabbath, if there's one thing, one test of whether someone's a world changer or not, in the worst sense of the word, is do they keep the Sabbath and remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And if you meet someone who really does that, then they're on their way. It's not the only thing, but it's an important thing.
Great, we have another one.
Thank you so much for sharing from the heart.
Thank you.
The question I have, though, is if I am not to transform the world, what did Jesus mean when he said, you are the light
Yes.
of the world and that
Yes.
you are the salt?
The salt. Yeah.
So I don't
Beautiful.
know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, Jesus certainly does not intend that we withdraw from the world. Actually, there are a lot of wonderful metaphors for what we're supposed to do. Be light. Be salt. Be citizens of another kingdom. There's a lot of great metaphors. I just want us to stop using this phrase, change the world. That's the only thing. I don't want us to stop loving our neighbors. I don't want us to stop building organizations and institutions. I don't want us to stop engaging in God's mission, because that's what God's people are called to do. I just want us to lay down the hubris of this thing we'll never achieve. We will you can be the light of the world. And the people of God are the light of the world, all over the world. You can be salt in the place where God's put you. But you cannot do this massive thing that we all talk about so blithely. So I just want us to lay that down. I don't want us to lay down participation in God's mission at all. That's that's what we get to do. But it's human scale rather than God scale. Let God do the God scale thing. That's the changing the world part. You, on your Robben Island, or in your Egypt, wherever you are, you just be faithful, be salt, light, and let God change the world around you, and you just get to enjoy it rather than run it. Is that helpful? Yeah.